clandestine time.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Clandestine. I'm Tom Secker, coming to you from the grassy knolls of North Yorkshire, and this is a Clandestine special, Brexit, the Royal Family, and Union Jackboot. This week, I welcome Matt Alford to the show to talk about the media manipulation of the image of the British royal family and how it relates to British foreign policy, including Brexit. From the killing of rare animals, to closet fascism, to interfering in politics and criminal investigations, we look at numerous stories that reveal the dark underbelly of the royals. We also discuss Matt's new book, Union Jackboot, What Your Media and Professors Don't Tell You About British Foreign Policy, and make a few tentative predictions about Brexit. Okay, well, welcome Matt, welcome to the podcast. As always, it's good to be talking to you. Hope you're doing all right today.
Yeah, thanks, I'm doing fine, thanks. Cheers, Tom, hello.
Well, I suppose we've got a bunch of different things we kind of had on the slate to talk about today. This is going to be fairly ramshackle and informal. I certainly don't have any notes or any proper questions or anything in front of me, but the other week we were...
Oh, for God's sake.
What I usually do. God. I usually actually try and prepare for these things properly. But
exactly, but it doesn't. When you're doing it with me, it's just like, oh, whatever. I've got a book in front of me. I've got notes. I've bought special headphones for this. But fine, yeah, whatever.
Okay.
I've got grapes, so I don't lose energy during the show.
You got your coffee? Yeah.
Yeah, well, we've faffed around so much that I've actually drunk the coffee.
Okay. Well, I mean, the other week, let's start off with this whole royal family thing, because the other week we're having just totally impromptu chat on the phone and this came up. But you pointed to a number of pretty interesting and pretty telling things about the royal family. Just little news stories that, you know, they get picked up, they're in the news for a day, usually a little article, mostly on the online editions, not actually in the, newspapers themselves. And then they get dropped and forgotten about. And as a result, everyone either doesn't read them to begin with or forgets about them within a few days. And so the impression is lost. But, yeah, go on. I mean, throw a few of those out there, those things that we were discussing the other week.
This comes in the context of, I've co-authored a book called Union Jackboot, the subtitle of which is What Your Media and Professors Don't Tell You About British Foreign Policy. And this is a series of discussions transcribed between me and a researcher called Tim Coles at the University of Plymouth. He's an expert in British foreign policy. He's particularly looked at documents that sort of internal documents from the British state, which shows that Britain is actually relatively powerful in the world, and that the idea that its empire has been entirely dissolved is not really the case, and that Britain retains training, for example, training quite repressive forces or terrorist organisations in well over a dozen different countries, obscure countries that you wouldn't have thought that Britain would be involved in. And so the idea basically behind the book was showing how Britain is quite a nefarious and powerful player on the world scene. And then out of that, you and I were having a bit of a chat the other day and thinking about the symbols of British power. And one of those was the British royal family. I think there are several stories that come up, and I think it was your analysis that pointed out that actually all of these stories, whenever they do come up, are completely decontextualized, more so than anything else that you'd see in the news. there was a story a few years ago that there were a couple of rare birds, for example, that had been shot in the fields near Prince Harry's house, and the police investigated, and there was a tiny report on this, which basically said that the police were looking into who did this, because it carries a prison sentence to kill these birds because they're endangered. And then the police said, we've only got two suspects. We've only got one suspect, and that's Prince Harry and his entourage. And then they just quietly dropped the case. And of course, there's nothing further that they could do about that. And there's no big news story about it. It was just a half-a-page thing. They've realised that a senior member of the royal family has broken the law. And I'm not saying this is the worst thing in the world necessarily to kill an endangered bird.
No, sure.
Who knows? Maybe it was an accident. But basically, they know that he was guilty of that, but they couldn't prosecute. It's just interesting that there are lots of these cases where the royal family is basically operating above the law or behind a democratic veneer, and to me that strikes me as it's an indication to me that the royal family, just like Britain itself, is more powerful and sort of less benevolent than it often appears.
No, sure. I mean, one of the things about the royal family is that, I mean, you're right, they're very much a symbol of British power, both in the sense that they're, institutionally part of the setup, but also that we're always told, British Empire, that's something that fell apart after World War II. We're no longer this big empire, colonial power. That's all in the past. That's all an anachronism, blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of the same with the royal family, that, their power's diminished and they don't really have that much influence in politics anymore. And it's kind of all just sort of gone by the wayside. And that probably isn't true. I mean, you remember that story, I don't know, maybe might have even been 10 years ago now. It might have even been when Labour was still in power. That it was basically about these letters between Prince Charles and various politicians, like senior politicians, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Foreign Secretary, that kind of thing. And he was trying to influence policy. He was clearly trying to lean on these politicians to say, I'd prefer it if you did this or didn't do that, and so on. And you think, well, and again, that story, it just sort of comes out, and there's a little bit of a scandal about it. Ooh, Prince Charles in secret contact with ministers, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Then it gets dropped and forgotten about, and it's never referred to again.
Yeah.
The next time the question of the royal family having any kind of undue influence on politics comes up, they just don't refer to that earlier story. Even though it was on the BBC, it was fairly widely reported. Everyone knows that this happened, but we sort of politely look the other way. It's so British, isn't it?
Yeah, I do think it's weird, that decontextualization. They were called the Black Spider memos, which makes them, I know they were trying to make them sound a bit sinister, because they are, but that makes them sound way more sinister, perhaps. So, but yeah, it was funny when I did an interview a couple of months ago to promote this book, and literally while we were doing the interview, we were talking about the interference of the power of the British state, and how we sort of seem to ignore the power of the British state. I was being interviewed by Sean Stone, and just as we were saying it, and we were in quite a rush because I needed to get to my train, so we didn't have any time. We didn't have any time to waste. And then above our heads comes this fleet of bloody helicopters that totally ruins the interview, for about 3 minutes, And I was like, "Oh my God, look, we haven't got time to. Can we record through this?" And they're like, they've got all the cameras up, and they're like, "No, we can't record." And I said, "What's going on?" They're like, "Oh, that's just the Queen." That's just the Queen flying over. She does it every day. This fleet of helicopters,
with half a dozen Chinooks in tow. Yeah.
And I was like, "Don't you think that this might be a really good thing to keep in this interview? Because it's a symbol of how small groups of powerful people can." No one else can fly over London in the middle of the day and ruin my interview. And appropriately enough, they did cut that bit out of the interview, because we do look the other way.
Well, okay, here's another one that it interests me. I mean, maybe I'm getting a little bit into conspiracy land here, but you remember that story of the nurse that was like pranked by the Australian radio station. It was back when, what's her name, Kate Thingy, was in hospital with one of her miscellaneous children. And this Australian radio show phoned up and they got to talk to this nurse, and they kind of tricked this nurse into, I think they actually tricked her into putting her on the phone. They like pretended they were from St. James's Palace or whatever. And then she winds up dead a few days later, mysteriously hanged in her wardrobe. And that again was quite widely reported, and almost everyone seemed to be at least implying, was she whacked by the royal family?
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah,
but again, no kind of follow up, no serious investigation, and it was all just not like, it wasn't covered up or anything. It was almost like hung out there to say, yep, they might have killed her, but so what? We're not going to do anything. No one's getting arrested over this. No one's getting prosecuted for this. So it's just sort of one of those funny little sort of Game of Thrones style storylines we get about the royal family.
I know what you mean.
I mean, who else could get away with that? Who else would have that kind of media coverage about a potential murder?
Yeah, I agree. And I'm obviously I'm interested in conspiracies and so on, but I think what happened there was, you got a couple of Australian DJs who were playing a silly prank. Those kind of prank phone calls have become rather less fashionable, and they tried to call up Kate Middleton and pretend that they were the Queen or whatever it was, and the nurse on duty let that phone call go through. Now, I don't think that it's very likely that the royal family, for the sake of a nurse making that mistake, an administrative mistake, I don't think the royal family are actually going to bump her off.
Probably not.
Do you know what I mean? It's like, I'm all for conspiracies, but
that seems excessive. Yeah.
But what is interesting, I think, is that that the nurse felt that level of pressure on herself, that she had made this mistake that was so bad, which was literally just, she was manning a telephone and let a phone call go through, and it inconvenienced someone for 5 minutes. I mean, honestly, really, that's not a reason to kill yourself. So I'm wondering, and I just think it's a legitimate question. I'm not even saying anything happened, but I'm wondering how heavy were the palace courtiers with that woman? Did they say something to her that may not have been very good for her mental health? Were they so protective of the future Queen of England that they actually made this a really horrible situation for her? Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That seems to me more plausible, that she was not necessarily bullied into killing herself, but that, she was a little bit prompted into that by very heavy-handed PR people surrounding the royal family. I mean, I just don't know, but that seems like a legitimate line of inquiry to me, because as it is, all we have is, oh yeah, a nurse felt really bad about letting the wrong phone call through. 2 days later, she's killed herself.
Yeah. There's no detail.
Like
there's no context.
No one else,
there's no teasing this thing out. Yeah.
No, and no one else would ever have that kind of coverage. The press would be all over that. So yeah, I mean that's another really good example.
Well, what are the? This is perhaps somewhat trivial by comparison to someone's life, but another one that occurred to me when I was thinking about this morning was back when Harry was the illegitimate grandson. Back when Harry was in the army, or he was whatever part of the British military he was in, a video, like a night vision video, was leaked of Harry referring to a, Pakistani recruit of some sort. I don't know, brown-skinned in any case. And he, in the video, you see Harry going, "Fuck me, you look like a raghead."
Oh, yes. Again, even I forgot that one. Yes.
And this was quite a tabloid storm at the time. And the funny thing about it was St. James's Palace just doubled down on it. They didn't try and apologise. They didn't try and make excuses. They just issued this statement that basically said, raghead is a standard British military term for a Taliban or insurgent. And it's that usual thing of, oh, well, everyone else was doing it. And it's like, well, no one would use that as an excuse if they'd stolen a car or beaten someone up. You don't go to court and say, oh, well, everyone beats people up, so who cares? That's not an excuse. That's not a defence. But, that they just sort of said, oh, well, it's a standard thing. And it may well be a standard thing in the military. I'm not saying it isn't. It just seemed like such a bizarre way of trying to spin that story.
Yeah.
And you think, who else would get away with that? If that was a cabinet minister, they'd be sacked. No question. They'd be gone.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was just thinking about another one. I was just checking it online while we're talking, because I remember this was years ago. So I've just checked the year. It was 2003. I remember there've always been these rumours, and it's kind of common currency amongst the British public that, everyone knows that Prince Harry's real father isn't Prince Charles, and that it's James Hewitt, who is a lover of Princess Diana. And I'm sorry if I'm offending anyone by saying that, but that's just basically what British discourse tends to. It's kind of just obvious, and maybe I'm wrong. But what I found really interesting was that there was this headline on the front page of the Sun in 2003. I remember it at the time, and it was the News of the World. The News of the World had obtained DNA from Harry, which proved that he was not James Hewitt's son, and therefore that he was legitimate. Now, to me, there's something really weird going on there, because how did the News of the World acquire DNA from the Prince of the Realm and then match that to the other relevant people's DNA to demonstrate, that everything's fine with the royal family? There's something that's gone on there. You can't just go around snipping off hair from any human being, let alone a prince of the realm. How does DNA testing work? But I don't think that a newspaper can just go around and do that. And they didn't explain, as far as I can see, they haven't explained how they did that or anything about it. Just
where the DNA came from, who the lab was, any of that stuff. Yeah,
exactly. It's just so bizarre.
Well, and the other funny thing is, with a DNA testing like that, even if they actually did it, which we don't know, but whatever.
It doesn't sound very likely, does it?
It doesn't sound very likely. It sounds totally made up, to be frank. But even if they did that, okay, so they may have proved that he's not Hewitt's son. Did they prove that he was Prince Charles's son? Did they match his DNA, or did they just prove this DNA isn't closely enough related to this DNA of Hewitt's, and therefore he wasn't his son? Well, if they proved it wasn't Hewitt, then who was it? Because no one really seems to think that he's Charles's son. He doesn't look anything like him, whereas, William does. William looks like all of them, members of that family. And the older he gets, the more and more he looks like Prince Philip and Prince Charles and the rest of them. So that kind of even leaves it as an open question, which surely isn't what they were trying to do. They were presumably trying to dispel this story, but
I got
bizarre.
I get the impression that the tabloid press are, I've got a really good relationship with the royal family, and therefore, that was just put out as a, purely as a piece of not even spin, just a flat out lie, just to end people continuing to speculate about that. I don't know. I mean, who knows? But it's interesting that those normal questions are never asked, and that's, I think, the point that you were making when we were chatting about it the other day. And I think that's the sort of important thing. It's the same thing with the death. I don't really want to get into the details of the death of Diana, but the obvious questions aren't asked about that by the mainstream press, except for the Daily Express, of course, which put it on its front page for about 10 years running. But do you know what I mean? Like, there was a documentary that was on a few months ago where, they were literally saying the whole narrative point, the whole point of the show was, Diana was an absolute nightmare. It was the royal family was imploding. It looked like it was going to be the end for the monarchy. And then they go, and then Diana died, and the royal family was able to move on its a great PR effort and became much loved in the British public again. And it's like, okay, that's fine, and I'm not saying anything untoward happened, but why aren't you asking the obvious question? Isn't there a bit of a coincidence there? No one else would ever think that. If that happened in the past, in history, that had occurred within the royal family, everyone would be screaming murder, or at least asking the question. But actually, when it comes up on documentaries, it's and in much of the mainstream discourse, that the question is just ignored. It's like the same. Remember the other example that really made me laugh, where Paul Burrell, the butler to Diana, and we should get on to talking a little bit about British foreign policy in general shortly, but. Yeah. Paul Burrell, or maybe you can edit it. Paul Burrell was the butler to Diana, and he was accused, I think, of having stolen some of Diana's things. And he said, "Oh no, I was given them by Diana." And there was going to be a police investigation into it, and it all became a big thing again in the press. It was, for a couple of weeks or whatever, it was a big issue, and it was the talking point. It was the thing that people were talking about by the water cooler, whatever at work, blah blah blah, and. Then at the last minute, just before the police got properly involved and started to question him, because that would have brought out all sorts of new things about Diana and all that, the Queen herself intervened and said, "Oh, I just remembered, the butler was given that stuff by Diana." It's like, whatever it was, like tiaras and things. And it just struck me that, first of all, the Queen being involved in a police investigation, which even, the BBC were reporting at the time, this is extraordinary that this has occurred. Mm-hmm. Just in the same way as that we always report it as being extraordinary whenever the Queen gets involved in anything. But we know that the Queen got involved in the vote about Scottish independence, for example, because she said she didn't want Scotland to break up. She told David Cameron, Prime Minister, that she didn't want it to happen. So every time it always happens that they get involved, and then they say, "This is extraordinary that the monarch is involved," because they never usually do politics unless they're signing the death warrant for someone in the there's several cases that wasn't there in the colonies where the Queens had to sign off on death warrants, something. They're intervening in politics all the time. But the case of Paul Burrell, the butler, so the police didn't end up getting involved in that because of the Queen's intervention. But of course, how on earth was the Queen to know whether Diana in the 90s had given her butler certain bits of property? It's just obviously nonsense. And there was a really interesting quote, and I haven't got it in front of me, but basically Paul Burrell then told the newspapers that the Queen looked at me in the eye and said, "There are dark forces in this country that we do not know of, and basically, be very careful, Paul. There are dark forces in this country, be very careful, that we do not know of, be very careful." Now, and then Paul Burrell, the butler, and the press all reported this by saying, "The Queen was just looking out for me. She's a really lovely lady." No, wait, no. Any normal interpretation of what he says the Queen said to him, that is a death threat. It is a death threat from the Queen. She fixed me with a pleasant stare or an evil glare and said, "There are dark forces." And this was all headline news. The dark forces. The newspapers were saying, tabloid press, what are these dark forces? Well, of course, what dark forces are there in this country that are going to kill off a butler? What is this like a great communist conspiracy to kill off butlers? No, the only enemy that he could possibly have is the royal family itself. So, but no one would interpret it like that, including him. And that's because this family is, personally, I suspect it is likely that all of those things that we've just said are true. That Harry will have killed the endangered bird. The Queen was issuing a death threat there. I think that the Diana conspiracy is probably right. But even if they're not right, the point is, why aren't those questions asked? Why is it seen as such a taboo that about the royal family? And why is it that that every time, even though these things happen quite regularly, Harry dressing as a Nazi for a fancy dress, no one would do that at the age of 20. No one's that's, I know we were like, "Oh yeah, it was just Harry, he's just young, isn't he?" And, yeah, but no one would do that. And what kind of mates did he have that were allowing him to do that? What kind of company is he keeping? But every time these things happen, every couple of years, there's some horrendous scandal. There was remember that scandal, the rape tape in the early 1990s to do with Prince Charles's courting? It was like again, every time every couple of years, there's some horrendous new thing that comes up for a couple of days and then it dies a death in the press. So I just think it's really interesting.
Well, and I mean, just to round off on this, the point that I made was that if this was Kevin Spacey or Harvey Weinstein, Moonves at CBS, all these kinds of figures, and there was a new allegation against them, and that's what the story is, fresh allegations against whoever, they would give you, and this scandal started in such and so many people have come forward and said this, that, and the other, and you would get context, you would get a sense of this is the latest round in an ongoing scandal. With the royal family, it's always treated in isolation. And like you said, it's always, this is so shocking. We didn't realize that the royal family were ever involved in politics or criminal investigations or anything. We've never heard of this before. And it's like, well, yeah, you have. You wrote the same basic story 2 years ago. So either you've simply forgotten, in which case you're a fairly incompetent journalist, or you're deliberately framing this as a series of isolated, atomized events so that there's no sense of them being a powerful institution that is constantly doing these things. And if it was anyone else, they wouldn't get treated like that. They just wouldn't. If this was government, celebrity, whoever, who'd done these things, it would get reported more widely and more consistently, and people would, they would bring it up again 2 years later when the next scandal hit. But just doesn't happen.
I agree. Although they do seem to be really nice and very charming, don't they? Particularly the young ones.
They're well trained.
Yeah, well, that might be it. I saw Prince Andrew at a graduation ceremony a couple of years ago, and he just seemed utterly delightful. So down to earth. So I don't know what it all adds up
when he's not busy taking bribes to sell weapons to the Saudis. Yeah, I'm sure he's a lovely guy.
Yeah.
And on that note, British foreign policy. Yeah, your new book, Matt. Your new book, Union Jackboot. I read a copy of this over the summer while you were still working on it. But it's great. It's a really accessible book. I loved the format. I love the dialogue format. I thought that's a really, really good way to present this stuff. Because usually books about, particularly academic books, no offense, but you know what I'm saying, they're generally quite dry, long paragraphs, long sentences. It's not very natural language. It's very analytical and kind of detached, and you don't really get carried along by those sorts of books. They can be very informative and very good as, research resources, but they're not great reads. Whereas Union Jackboot, I got through it in a couple of days quite easily. It's very, very easy to read. It's, each section takes you on to the next one, and yet there's still loads of really great information in there. So yeah. I mean, would you like to talk about Union Jackboot a bit? I mean, how did this project come about? Why you did it? That kind of thing?
Well, me and Tim Coles went on Russia Today together, and Tim wanted me to come along, I guess just because I think he liked the fact that I quite enjoy doing things on camera and a bit more performative than he is. And then we were there to talk about British foreign policy, which is not really it wasn't really an area that I knew loads about. Obviously, I've followed it over the past couple of decades, but not in detail. And then from that, it led to, I said, well, look, basically Tim is really on a roll, I would say. The last few years, he has written several books which are really detailed, carefully written, carefully researched. One called Human Wrongs, which is about human rights, if you like. And another one about British foreign policy called Britain's Secret Wars. And it just struck me that he was doing something really original, and generating a lot of output, basically, and also being ignored, really, because he was saying lots of terrible things about the British state. And I think there's always this tendency for us in this kind of field to look to the United States. I think for good reason, because it's such a dangerous country. But I think to take a bit of time to have a look at what's happening with British foreign policy, I think it was really worthwhile. So I suggested that we have when we started talking about that interview in advance, because I wanted to be a bit more up to speed on British foreign policy, I was saying, look, this is really interesting, everything you're saying. We should transcribe these these discussions and see where it leads. And that's exactly what happened. So we started transcribing discussions. He then came in and said, well, I want to make this book look really nice and look really good. And so he put in to the book format lots of graffiti that he had taken photographs of over the past few years from around Plymouth. And then I put into the book a series of sort of political jokes that I'd been working on. And so the book as a whole ended up looking really and feeling really quite nice. So I quite enjoyed that process of putting together. But actually, the more substantive thing of it is that we're covering many different areas, which I think will be of genuine interest to anyone really who's following British politics. We talk in detail about Brexit. We talk in detail about Jeremy Corbyn and his representation. We talk about British arms sales because, kind of forget that we're the second biggest arms exporter at the moment. Talk about, the fact that British soldiers are still overseas in many different countries, not just in Afghanistan and Iraq, but, also in places like Germany, like the Cold War is not entirely over in that sense. Not saying that the Germans necessarily mind us being there, but the British presence all over the world, including in other places, Bangladesh and Burma and, Sri Lanka, we've got, even if it's just small forces there to train, different factions, we are playing a role all over the place, and often that is designed to help British. Well, it makes it sound nice to say that it's to help British investment, but actually it's to kind of it's to drive down. It's part of an effort to drive down wages, so that the third world is kind of treated really badly, and that we can have kind of a world of sweatshops and cheap clothing.
Well, and how else does Royal Dutch Shell make that kind of a profit? If you had to pay the local people a reasonable and fair amount of money to actually get the stuff out the ground and stick it on a tanker, those profits get eaten into.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. And it's this, similar situation in, say, Nigeria, which is where there are big oil companies, British oil companies, and of course, Where does that lead? I mean, I'm not saying that having an oil company in your country is necessarily the worst thing in the world, because maybe there are benefits from it. But actually, if your wages are being kept down as part of that process, if there is pollution that is created by oil that's leaking out of pipes, which is just inevitable when you've got miles and miles of pipeline, and if when you've got locals who protest against that, they are going to be beaten down by the repressive government, then it suggests that
maybe it's not worth it.
If you're maybe that's not such a good thing, Tom, I suppose is what I'm saying. It raises that question.
Yeah, sure. Well, and like you say, when locals protest against whichever aspect of this they may protest against, if they're being beaten down and being forced off their land or whatever by local thugs, but those local thugs have been trained by the British state ultimately, then how is that fundamentally different from where we were 200 years ago with the East India Company and colonialism in its full glory, if you like? It's just a sort of slightly more democratic, maybe slightly more covert version of the same damn thing. And so it underlines that point we made at the top, that this notion that Britain is somehow not a powerful force in the world, when it's like, well, we've got like the 6th or 7th largest economy and one of the best equipped militaries, and we're a nuclear nation. We're in that small group of nations that have nuclear weapons. We're pretty powerful. We're not the United States, sure, but just because we're not the United States doesn't mean that we're an irrelevance.
Yeah, and also we may not be. It's like it's like the common thing is to compare British power to how it was in, say, the 19th century, or 1914, or 1939, or 1945. But just because we're not as powerful relative to the rest of the world as we were then, it doesn't mean that we're not powerful. This is still a really influential country. And of course, there's soft power to consider as well there, the cultural power. Britain often comes out at the top of those indices. So there's that to consider as well, which is, perhaps personally, I don't mind Britain. I don't mind the fact that the BBC does well around the world, that it's a popular and good brand. There are a lot worse things. But yeah, it's been really interesting speaking to Tim about this. I mean, there's other little obscure things that people just don't know, like the fact that the British the British state allowed licenses to sell weapons to North Korea, and lots of other countries that you just wouldn't think, but they just don't really care. And it's like they can say that it's for, it's not for internal repression, or it's, it's a protective weapon like a shield or a helmet or something rather than a machine gun or whatever it is. They find ways to make it seem less bad. But the British involvement, I'm just looking at the list of a few little bits and pieces I wanted to raise here. Britain's actively supporting the Saudi Arabian war in Yemen. I mean, that's just it's just incredible, really. I know that there's been some reporting on that more recently, and some more critical reporting. But, that war's been going on for over 2 years, and we've been, of course, arming Saudi throughout that entire period. And, I heard on the news, there's a couple of really instructive reports. I haven't got the quotes exactly to hand, but basically, the last few weeks, I heard a couple of really interesting things. One was, we are helping to, the British military is coordinating military operations on the ground in Yemen. But the Foreign Office insists this is not, this does not mean that we are working, that we have an alliance with Saudi Arabia. So basically they're doing on the ground, they are working with the Saudi Arabian military to destroy Yemen, but they are officially not calling it an alliance of any kind. So it's just, that kind of language is just, that came out of, I think that actually came out when, of Boris Johnson, not directly him, but the Foreign Office with him.
Well, it kind of leaves open the question, well, what do you call that relationship then?
Yeah, exactly. And there was another one where a member of Parliament, again, sorry, I can't remember the exact identity at the moment, but basically the member of Parliament was saying, and he was one of the senior people in the Conservative Party, and he was saying, we're on the wrong side in this. We're on the wrong side in this war, but that shouldn't stop us from selling the weapons to the Saudi Arabian side. So literally was saying it in the same sentence. This was on Radio 4. And the reason I haven't got his name noted down is because I was driving at the time and listening to Radio 4. But I encourage your listeners to check out what these people have said, get the specific quotes, look into it, because you'll find that these kind of peculiar contradictions occur all the time when we're talking about really nasty, sort of sociopathic groups of people in the Foreign Office, whatever it is. That's not to say everyone's evil in the Foreign Office. I mean, one of my old mates worked in the Foreign Office and said that he thought that William Hague was an absolutely delightful man, and I trust this guy's judgment. But at the same time, terribly nice men can do terribly awful things and say terribly contradictory things. I think that's just a standard part of the human condition, really. Shall I mention a few other little bits and pieces that come up in the book?
Yeah, please do.
Britain is making the world a more dangerous place. The Trident malfunction in 2015, in which a missile went towards the US by mistake and was shot down. The threats against the nuclear-armed Russia, of course, the whole relationship with Russia. Maybe we should do a different podcast about Russia because it's just so ridiculous. We're training Polish forces on the border. We're promoting policies that contribute, of course, to climate change as well, invading oil-rich Iraq, supporting oil-rich Saudi Arabia. We're using soft power to influence elections in other countries via organizations like the British Council and the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. In Ukraine, for example, no one reports on this. humanitarian intervention is an excuse to, these are just notes that Tim and I have made together, as an excuse to force other countries to do what our elites want. Think about, the fact that Britain was training the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, Islamic fundamentalists.
Narco-trafficking gang.
To provoke narco-traffickers as well. Yeah, I mean, as everyone accepts. But we're involved in that. Basically, what Tim's work is an extension of a very isolated few serious historians. People like Mark Curtis, who I know you know, wrote Secret Affairs and Web of Deceit. And what Curtis did, and a very small number of other people, Tim goes into detail in the book about, they have unearthed from government archives material that shows basically Britain acting like an imperial power all the way up to the sort of 1960s and 1970s. But what they don't do, even people like Mark Curtis, partly because the documentary record is more fragmented from the 1970s onwards, is that they don't really go into the British, the intricacies of British power now. And that's where Tim Cole's work comes in, because although it can't be just can't get as much documentation, as much reliable documentation from official archives as you can for things from 1970s and previous, you can still piece together quite a lot from using army sources and so on. And that's really the major value of his work, is that he's taking it out of that kind of dusty, that's just happened in the past. Oh, yeah, of course, Britain may have done a few bad things back in 1962 in Aden or whatever, but what Tim is doing is really updating that story for now. And I think that makes it so much more powerful. And I really recommend Tim's work in general. I mean, I think that Union Jackboot, I'm really happy with Union Jackboot. I'd say that Tim very much took a lead on this particular book. So I'm not sort of particularly patting myself on the back for that. I hope I'm not coming across as arrogant in that regard.
No, sure.
I would say that if you're interested in British foreign policy and British power in general, and these really key issues that are going on at the moment, to do with Britain's relationship with Russia, the involvement in the Syrian war, and blah blah blah, everything. It's a really good book, and people should get it for Christmas. Why don't they order it for Christmas? Is this podcast going to be out by then?
Should be, yeah.
But yeah, Union Jackboot, and we've stuck it up pretty much as cheaply as we could. I think it's on for about a tenner at the moment. Oh, and there's the other thing that I liked about what we did with this is that I don't know if you noticed that we've got a low budget third world version, which is the one for a tenner, and then we've got a colour version, which we call the Deluxe First World Edition. So not at that, but we just thought it was funny to do that.
Oh, it certainly is. Yeah. I mean, that made me laugh.
We talk a lot about conspiracy theories in the book. We talk about David Icke. We talk about Alex Jones. And so the book as a whole isn't just about sort of the narrower thing of, exactly what is Britain doing over the last 10 years in obscure countries. It's a much broader discussion than that. And I'd say that the only area that I kind of wanted to talk to Tim about that we didn't talk about that relates to our whole experience of Britain is the royal family, which is one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast, because I thought it'd be fun to talk more about the royal family. And it's just partly that it's just not an area that Tim particularly knew a great about. It was an area that I was a little bit more interested in, and I knew that you were as well. But other than that, I think we cover everything. Is there anything that we miss out in Union Jackboot? I don't think so. It's ace.
No, I mean, it is a really good book. It's absolutely fascinating to read. And as I say, the main thing I liked about it was how easy it was to read, because these are all dialogues that have been transcribed and obviously edited up a little bit to make them a bit smoother. But still, it's very organic. It's very natural to read. It's kind of like listening to a conversation, but obviously in reading form, in text form. So, yeah.
And also, I think it's one of the other purposes of the book was because when there are transcribed books with academics, they are often, there's often a kind of oh, Professor Coles, why don't you tell us what really happened in Yemen in 1963? Because me and Tim didn't really want that. Tim is a very a kind of an anarchic person himself. He wanted to do a photo shoot with us, with him dressed as a funeral director and me dressed as a gecko, because this alludes to the David Icke lizard theory. So we've done, all the photographs that we've got are of me in this giant lizard outfit. But basically, I guess the reason I'm saying that is that we didn't want this kind of false deference to Tim or to me, or to academia in general. So a lot of the questions that I'm asking him are things like, they're not just sort of softball questions. Sometimes they are things like, oh, come on, Tim. Why are you slagging off British foreign policy? We did the Nazis in. Stop being such a wimp. So, what would you have done in 1939? And so, that was the spirit of the phone calls in particular. We've touched up the transcript a little bit since then, and perhaps made it slightly more detailed and slightly dampened down that kind of irreverent feel in the actual dialogue. But that was the idea that if Tim did say something that seemed kind of ideologically driven, or an assumption, or just a kind of peacenik, lazy thing to say, I'd pick him up on it and say, no, what about this? Come on, you've just said that. Why, that's not right. Although I really liked him, I wasn't prepared to give him a particularly easy ride, and I thought that would make it more engaging for listeners. I mean, it's the same thing. Sorry for readers. It's the same thing with. I just sort of generally think that academics should be able to discuss things, ideas from left and right positions. And I've got no particular. I know everyone would a lot of people would pigeonhole me on the left, but I don't really see it like that. And people like Tim as well have a very, and I think you probably as well, actually. I know people would generally stick us on the left wing of things. Well, I'd say actually we've just a really brutal, realist view of the world, of international politics. And I think that could be, I think that people on the left or right could get behind our sort of analysis. Anyway, that's just my kind of...
No, I think you're right. I mean, I can't remember which one of us said this, but we were talking about this a couple of years back when we were still working on National Security Cinema, and we were saying, obviously this book is going to come across to quite a lot of people as being fairly left-wing, but nothing in the book actually says that. We're just anti-stupidity and anti-lies and anti-cruelty. Yep. It's not really about, I mean, if that makes you left-wing, then okay, I guess I'm left-wing, but you know what I mean? It's not really about that for us. It's not that we have our territory on the ideological spectrum that we're defending against everyone else. It's that we're sick of fucking being lied to by a bunch of murderous bastards.
Exactly.
Exactly. Where does that come into left and right? That's just being a decent, intelligent human being.
Well, Derek Swanson's work as well.
Yeah.
It's a similar thing. He's someone who made good money through advertising, and he's based in the center of New York, and I stayed with him earlier this year, and I'd say that he's worked within the capitalist system and done well at times, at least. But he's made these documentaries about American power and the banking sector, and he's not coming at that as being a socialist. And perhaps Caitlin Johnson, the journalist who they've worked together a little bit, isn't coming at it from a kind of socialist perspective, but more just a kind of, like you say, we don't want a bunch of sociopaths, unaccountable in cliques, doing horrible things to our country and to our world, and particularly when that could lead to massive destruction because of nuclear weapons and climate change, blah, 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 blah. But I don't think that they're ideological things, really. And I'd count Tim as one of those people amongst that sort of that way of thinking. But when he does occasionally come across a bit sort of peacenicky, I will pick him up on it.
No, I did like how you played devil's advocate in the book. It was if nothing else, it kind of added a bit of humour among all of the, because to be honest, reading some of this stuff is a little bit depressing, because it's depressing stuff. It's not that, anything you did in the way you wrote the book. It was just reading about this. It's kind of fucking horrible. It just is.
Yeah.
So,
although I would say that, I don't know. I mean, it's terrible to make a prediction on a, on a podcast, particularly one that probably won't be broadcast for a couple of weeks. But we've got the whole Brexit negotiation, for example. It could lead to a Labour government, and I'm not saying I agree with everything ideologue, blah blah blah, with Labour, whatever. But I think it's pretty. I think it's just so clear that a Labour government, which is going to invest a little bit more and be a bit more wary of getting into foreign wars and blah, 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 blah. It's just going to be way better. It's just going to be way better. And it's also clear that the Conservative Party have been so bad that Brexit has come from that internal fight, from the right wing of the Conservative Party that's just sort of led to this chaotic situation. Whether you agree with Brexit or don't, it's just obviously led to a huge amount of instability. But my feeling is that, there should be optimism, because I think it can only be that bad for at a political level. That level of chaos can only reign for so long, and then there will be a something to balance that. And I suspect that it could well be the imposition of a Labour government, and that will be a better situation. Obviously, I'm not sanguine about that, and I'm not saying it for certain, but I do think that could well be the result, is that things will ping back at times, and I think we might be at the moment there is something about to ping back, and some kind of rationality is going to be restored.
Well, on the Brexit subject, since you've brought it up, since it seems impossible to avoid, really, as we're recording this is just after the government, or at least Theresa May, has lost a series of votes. She's now going to have to publish the whole legal advice on the Brexit situation and a bunch of other stuff, like if this deal is voted down, then will Parliament have a vote on what happens next? Stuff like that. She seems to be losing all these votes at the moment. She doesn't seem to have anything like a majority in Parliament to carry any of this stuff through. And I think it's next week, they're actually voting, the MPs, the Parliament is voting on the negotiated deal with the EU for the exiting, the Brexit. Do you want to make a prediction about that? Or, I mean, I'll make a prediction. I'm happy to make a prediction. I don't think she's got enough. I don't think the government has enough support. I don't think that deal is going to go through. I don't know what then happens, but I'm relatively convinced the vote next week will go against the government and against the Brexit deal as it's currently stands.
Yeah, well, that's next Tuesday, and I think probably by the time this podcast goes out, that point may have passed. So I'm not going to make a big thing about it, but I've just sort of suggested what my prediction is, which is, albeit with a scattering of optimism sprinkled on this Brexit cake. I think the vote will quite possibly be much closer than people are currently predicting, because they're suggesting that she's going to lose by 100 votes at the moment. I think that
probably not that.
The press are starting to. I went to a talk yesterday on from my head of department, and the press are. He pointed out how the tabloid press is just starting to get behind Theresa May a little bit more on this particular deal, even though the deal seems not to satisfy even people who wanted a Brexit. But yeah, and so I think that the vote may be a bit closer, but I think she'll lose it, and then it looks like it will surely lead to vote of no confidence, leadership challenge. New leader won't be able to command. Will not be able to get anything through. It will lead to general election, quite possibly a Labour government, second referendum, which I think the Labour government's been increasingly moving towards over the past year, and then I think remain in Europe. And I mean, the thing is, though, as Tim points out, the European project as a whole, as you can see from the example of the EU's treatment of Greece and so on, is not a very good thing. So, I mean, just sorting out the issue of remain and leave and remaining in the European Union is not a panacea here, as Tim goes into in detail in the book. But I do think that there's time, I think, for a bit of a swing back towards rationality in British politics. It may not be a big swing, but I think there'll be a little bit of that in the coming weeks.
Well, we can hope so, anyway. And why not be optimistic?
Exactly. Is that but whether Corbyn can challenge the sort of the British equivalent of the deep state, that's another question.
I have my strong doubts about that.
Yeah, but you've always been very suspicious about that, and I think for good reason. I think I noticed. I think maybe we should sort of wind up because we've been going for about an hour.
Sure.
Not that I mind carrying on, but
no, it's cool. Yeah.
About 18 months ago, that Corbyn was videoed on a train by, I think it was like local news, and I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but I saw just for about a quarter of a second it flicked past his hands, and he was reading a book, and it was that book about the assassination of Dag Hammarskjöld. Do you know the UN general from the 1960s who died in a plane crash? And I noticed that it was that book by the woman who basically, I think, is she called Susan? I've forgotten her name off the top of my head. But basically, it was the book that used new documentation to show basically that the powers that be, whoever exactly they were, killed Hammarskjöld. It was just interesting to me that was Corbyn's main reading, sort of, that was the thing that he was reading a couple of years ago on a train just after he'd become leader, maybe kind of aware of the power of the deep state, and wanted to sort of brush up on that a little bit.
I mean, I have no doubt that Corbyn knows quite a lot of this stuff, but I guess, it's partly because our political spectrum in this country is so narrow that he's seen as a radical simply for being a left-wing social democrat. He's faced enough opposition just for that, just for going, austerity doesn't work, let alone all the stuff beyond that. So I can understand why, from his perspective, he's actually trying to, he's trying to win an election now. He's trying to actually get somewhere in politics for the first time in his career, at the ripe old age of, 71 or whatever he's going to be by the time there's actually an election. But you know what I mean? The guy, there's only so far any politician can go. I just feel a bit, I don't know, I look back at the Labour of the 1980s, and I look back at, for example, Robin Cook's campaign about the security services, saying, look, there's no formal legislation governing what MI5 and MI6 do. In fact, you're still pretending MI6 doesn't actually exist. So, and he ran a campaign for the whole of the 1980s, and this is why MI5 and MI6 were actually put on a legal footing and were actually made, public agencies of some sort for the first time. And okay, there's problems with that, but nonetheless, that came from the Labour movement, that came from the Labour Party, whereas these days, you have enough trouble just with the neoliberals in the Labour Party, let alone the notion that they would be as radical as to actually say, hang on, should we not have better oversight of the intelligence services, since they seem to be basically doing whatever the hell they want, and most of the time we don't even know what that is. It's not part of the discussion. And it isn't part of the discussion in almost any country. It's hardly like this is only Corbyn and the Labour Party's fault. This is the case across the Western world. It's just not part of the dialogue anymore. Whereas, in that late Cold War period, it was. And there was a chance then to maybe have taken a few shots at them and at least done something to clip their wings. But I'm pessimistic about Corbyn doing that, but I don't particularly blame him for it.
Yeah.
I understand why he's in the position he's in. It just frustrates me as all, because, me, I'm kind of naturally an anarchist when it comes to these kind of things. So, but, we're never going to get an anarchist prime minister. In fact, it would be a contradiction in terms. So there you are.
Yeah, well, I agree with all that. And very well put.
Well, okay. Let's wrap this up now. Thanks for coming on, Matt. Thanks for talking about all this. This has been a lot of fun. I think we've covered some fun stuff today, and some important stuff as well. So
yeah, hope so. Thanks very much, Tom.
Thanks, man. So that was my conversation with Matt. I hope you enjoyed it and that it was a bit of a change of pace, light-hearted and serious at the same time. And I can thoroughly recommend Matt and Tim's book, Union Jackboot. It'll make a great stocking filler. I will be back this weekend with an episode on Nazis in Hollywood. So until then, you've been listening to Clandestine with me, Tom Secker. So thanks for listening, and take care.